Hi gang, the Death Korps of Krieg have become one of the most iconic regiments in the armies of the Imperium of mankind, and not just because of silly shovel memes. Clad in greatcoats and gas masks, deployed only to the most desperate of battlefields, the Death Korps are a grim reminder of how far the fanatics of the Imperium are prepared to go to keep the wheels of the Astra Militarum grinding on. As always, if you'd like to support the channel, click likey subscribey, have a look in the description for links to affiliates, or stay tuned at the end for the latest merch. Though every regiment raised in the Imperium is somewhat different in appearance and tactics, the Kriegers are an anomaly even within the great variety of the Imperial Guard. Grim, silent, gas-masked siege troopers, some of the most dogged and brutal warriors found in the service of the Emperor, and trained in an atomic wasteland, Krieg is a man-made death world that raises its soldiers to be fanatically devoted to the Emperor and teaches them only to seek death in his name. In battle, their regiments are deployed to the most hazardous environments imaginable. War zones quickly find themselves riddled with trenches and gun emplacements as the Death Korps dig in, always prepared to go over the top and advance directly into enemy fire, supported by suicidal grenadier assaults, mass cavalry charges, and the ever-present big guns of their artillery batteries. Millions die every year across the galaxy, all in the name of gaining just another inch of ground for the Emperor, and yet they still keep coming. For their homeworld, Krieg produces nothing but soldiers for the armies of the Imperium. Regiment after regiment after regiment, raised every year, every one of them indoctrinated into a cult of sacrifice that sees them seeking only death in the Emperor's name. And this is all in the hope of atoning for their planet's ancient shame. For Krieg was not always a radioactive wasteland. Prior to M40, the world of Krieg was just another prosperous and industrious hive world within the bounds of the Imperium of Man, a thriving trading hub and manufacturing planet that was home to billions, ruled over by a noble caste known as the Autocrats, who governed the planet through a council of autocrats from all the major hive cities. Despite being called Krieg, the world was far from any war fronts and had known only peace, save for the regiments that it regularly raised and sent off to fight for the Astra Militarum, few of whom ever returned. However, as well as the usual issues that plague nobilities across the Imperium, indolence, petty vice, that sort of thing, the autocrats of Krieg were also extremely jealous of their own position and paranoid about either internal strife or outside invasion. And this led to them diverting much of the productivity of their planet towards defense, the strengthening of the defenses of the rival hive cities, the building up and maintenance of vast private armies, and even the construction of an orbiting ring of steel, a local war fleet to defend the planet. And that vast defense expenditure couldn't be tallied with the requirements of the imperial tithe, with the administratum demanding a significant portion of the world's productivity, often in the form of regiments of armed soldiers bound for the Imperial Guard. Many of the autocrats eventually came to resent the influence of the Imperium's authorities on what they saw as their world. This all came to a head in 433 M40. The Inquisition, stretched far and with limited coverage on Krieg, had begun to detect the first stirrings of discontent amongst the ruling class and dispatched orders to deploy the active Krieg 83rd Astra Militarum Regiment to a quiet backwater planet, and once there, they abducted and then interrogated its commanding officer, a Colonel Jurton, searching for proof of Krieg's potential rebellion. What they found was as loyal an Imperial officer as it was possible to get. Jurton was a fanatic, a devout believer in the Imperial cause, and an uncompromising commander who'd also heard the same rumours and was disgusted by them. Few other forces were available, and the Inquisition were reluctant to fan the flames of rebellion by deploying a fleet, so Jurton and the 83rd were recruited to journey back to Krieg under the pretense of resupplying their numbers and to ascertain the situation and report back to the Ordos. Jurten landed at the hive of Ferrograd and immediately started rebuilding his forces, snubbing the ruling chairman of the Council of Autocrats and possibly deliberately raising tensions. The autocrats knew Jurten would never agree to their slowly moving plans. He would always support the Imperium to the death if necessary, and so, feeling under pressure from the army that was building on their doorstep, the Council of Autocrats made their fateful move. To the great and eternal shame of every Krieger to this day, the chairman of the Council of Autocrats, a man so hated that his name has since been scrubbed from all records, on the day of the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, declared the planet's secession from the Imperium, placing the entire world under martial law and taking control of the planetary defense grid. That rebellion spread quickly through almost all of the major hives, and after a brief outburst of civil war, many of the other hives either enthusiastically joined with their ruler or capitulated to the opposing armies, all except one. In Hive Ferrograd, with the hive's leaders unsure which way to turn, Colonel Jurten quickly organised a coup, and Ferrograd became a rallying point for loyalists. But by this point, those loyalist forces were hopelessly outnumbered. Jurten contacted the Imperium for aid, reporting back his findings, but with the planetary defense grid in the hands of the traitors, he was informed that no fleet of a sufficient size was available to break through the Ring of Steel and deliver reinforcements. The Imperium trusted Krieg to Jurten's best judgment. Of course, the war that then broke out continued for years, Jurten often leading his forces personally. Under his leadership, the Hive, isolated by besieging armies of rebels, held out far longer than any could have predicted. Adopting a survivalist mentality, the entire resources of the Hive, the largest manufacturing hub on the planet, were retooled towards continuing the war, and this was helped by the presence of the Adeptus Mechanicus Majos Greel, one of Jurten's closest advisors, who had returned with him from campaign. Greel began to delve into the ancient ruins underneath the Hive City. His researchers and teams of servitors developed new technologies to help in the war, high-powered lasguns, more efficient manufacturing procedures. In fact, much of the infrastructure of Ferrograd was moved below ground to save it from rebel bombing, into a new network of caverns and tunnels Greel had constructed in the ancient Underhive. Whole cities were built deep under Ferrograd to house the refugees from other hives or the population of Ferrograd whose own uphive homes had been destroyed. And eventually, deep beneath that hive, Greel discovered a terrible secret. Stored in a vault beneath the hive were ancient weapons, missiles of immense power, relics of the dark age of technology. Weapons that could destroy a planet. Officially, the defenders of Hive Ferrograd, Jurten and his senior officers, decided that they could never be used. So destructive could they be to the world. But as the war dragged on, the stockpile became more and more tempting. After years more of grueling warfare, and with the defenders of Hive Ferrograd bled dry, Jurten finally gave in to the advice from Majos Greel, who had calculated no other possible way to win. Heading off an attempted coup by his own senior officers, Jurten gave the order. Again on the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, now renamed Independence Day by the rebels, the entire stockpile of ancient missiles were launched into the atmosphere. It was known as the Purging of Krieg. Within days, the climate of the planet collapsed. Atomic fire swept across the surface, hives burned, and untold billions died, freezing in the cold of a nuclear winter. The air was poisoned, the only survivors those that could escape to the subterranean fallout shelters underneath the hives. Both sides suffered unimaginable losses, but the loyalists had at least been prepared, and Colonel Jurten's purge had evened the odds. But while the planetary defences were now all but deactivated, and the cruisers of the Ring of Steel bereft of resupply or command, the industry and infrastructure of Krieg was gone too, and with it its value to the Imperium. To the wider Imperial authorities, the planet was simply written off, lost, with nothing of value worth recovering. The grim Colonel Jurten had destroyed a planet to stop it falling to the rebels, and Krieg would be of no more value to the wider galaxy. However, on the planet, under the surface, the survivors still fought on. Ferrograd had been moved entirely into the Underhive, a total war society dedicated to the production of soldiers to keep their conflict going. Tests were conducted, finding that troopers, covered head to toe, masked, their uniforms impregnated against the foul air and radiation, could survive on the surface, and the youth of the Hive were inducted into new armies who marched out from Ferrograd towards the rebel hives, slowly clearing the ruined cities of the remains of those rebels, many of whom were now hideously mutated and living in the rubble. Jurton eventually died, likely from complications from radioactive fallout, but for the next 15 generations, the descendants of the survivors fought on. The world devolved into a planet-wide war zone. In an attempt to stop communication between the rebel hives, they were besieged by Ferrograd's new armies. Over hundreds of years, a constant bloody war of attrition waged between the secessionists and the loyalists, both sides growing ever more fervent, brutal, and callous in their devotion to their cause. The planet's surface became covered with trench lines and razor wire, fed by the bones of generations of dead as the new settlements of Krieg spread under the surface, each generation knowing only war as they carried on the fight. And finally, new technologies were introduced by Greel, unhallowed ways to speed up the production and hardiness of Ferrograd's young soldiers, such as the controversial Vitae womb. Naming themselves the Death Korps, the gas-masked and grape-coated descendants of the survivors battled through the rad wastes and ruins for 500 years, and inch by inch, the Loyalists slowly retook the world. 4 months after the final reconquest of Krieg, the first Imperial shuttle touched down on the planet in centuries. The Krieg commanding officer, a gas-masked colonel who, after being forced to give a name, stated it as Jurton, declared the planet loyal and professed the great desire of his people to atone for their sins. In tribute, they offered up not one, but 20 fully trained regiments for the Imperial Guard. 20 regiments of, by this point, veteran siege troopers, formed and equipped, and with each of their commanders requesting the most hazardous war zones for assignment. And in addition to this, there was an entire subterranean society dedicated to the production of even more. Over the 500 years of their war, the entirety of Krieg had been turned over to the production of arms, equipment, and soldiers. Implacable, brutal soldiers, all indoctrinated to the point of fanaticism in the Imperial Creed and desperate to atone for the sins of their planet. Initial tests were conducted by the Inquisitor Larath, whose report highlighted numerous questionable practices amongst these new Kriegers, but the Departamento Munitorum, stretched for reinforcements as it was eager to just overlook those, and so, judging the planet to be overall loyal and compliant, Krieg was finally accepted back into the Imperial fold in 949 M41, and the more controversial sections of the Inquisitor's report were placed under the highest of security clearances. After some initial testing in which the soldiers of Krieg proved their worth again and again in the most horrific of environments, Krieg was taken directly under the Departamento Munitorum's wing. The maximum tithe level was applied. Krieg's sole job now would be to produce regiments for the Astra Militarum, and nothing would be allowed to interfere with this by order of the High Lords. Specialist Adeptus Mechanicus delegations were sent to speed up the production of corpsmen yet again. Dozens of oversized regiments would be raised every year, where a comparably sized planet might only raise 1 or 2, and these would be deployed across the Imperium into the harshest of war zones, suffering the greatest rates of attrition, only to be replaced by more corpsmen fresh from the atomic wastelands of the planet. Krieg would finally get its chance to atone for its 500 years of heresy. Since then, the forces of the Death Korps of Krieg have been deployed by the Astra Militarum across the galaxy and have been proven to be exemplary soldiers, achieving victories in the face of impossible odds by dint of bloody sacrifice, endurance, desperate aggression, and unbreaking loyalty. Death Korps soldiers are subject to some of the harshest training methods in the Imperium of Man. Selected and trained from let's say birth, a corpsman, and the term can apply to either gender, is beaten into shape by a brutal regime of physical hardship and conditioning. Armies of trainees are deployed to the surface of Krieg to fight mock battles amongst its radioactive ruins. Mock battles that are still fought at full lethality, ensuring only the strongest and most capable survive. Amongst the war-blasted landscapes, new recruits clear ancient minefields, dig trenches into the blood-soaked mud, and are thrown into the most dangerous environments the planet can offer. Given the way their regiments operate, corpsmen are cross-trained in all standard Astra Militarum weaponry and equipment, with a particular emphasis on hand-to-hand combat with bayonets and battlefield engineering, construction of trench works and defences. For most Krieg soldiers, this life is all they know, an existence completely dedicated to training and warfare, with no goal other than deployment into the Emperor's armies and a death in his name. In fact, it's that mindset that's the most unique thing about the Death Korps of Krieg, and the most unsettling for those they fight alongside. The training on Krieg, the entire culture, enforces and indoctrinates its population into an extremely rigid and fatalistic philosophy known as the cult of sacrifice. To the Kriegers, theirs is a legacy of shame. Shame for their planet's rebellion, and shame for the steps taken to return it to the Emperor. A corpsman's only goal should be atonement, and their only purpose is to spend their life in the service of the Emperor. Their entire lives are lived so that they might find death in the Emperor's name. Their only ambition to die in such a way that their death counts for something. Anything. The expenditure of another enemy bullet, the gaining of an inch of land, the advancement of a trench line or a dugout another centimetre. By such tiny sacrifices are the Emperor's plans advanced, and the life of a corpsman is an acceptable expenditure for that cause. Their doctrine dictates that any battle where their capacity and willingness to fight and die outstrips that of the enemy is already won. Kriegers are raised not to fear death, but to seek it, to see it as the only goal in their extremely short lives. A dead Krieger is not mourned or given any respect at all by their comrades. They did their duty and they got their reward. Even those wounded enough to stop them immediately fighting are likely to be left for dead or given the Emperor's mercy by their comrades. For who are they to slow down the prosecution of a battle? The corpsmen raised by Krieg are educated exactly as much as is needed to follow orders and prosecute their wars. Their fanatical faith burned into them, and any independent thought heavily discouraged. Corpsmen don't even have names, just identification numbers and ranks. Only their officers are ever granted names, and that's only because the Departamento Munitorum expects it. When they do have to choose a name, they often pick one from their own history, like the names of famed aides to Colonel Jerton, in honour of the people's hero. Unlike many planets, there's also no officer class or nobility in the Death Korps. Advancement is by dint of ability, or often mere survival. The Kriegers' self-sacrificing nature and the war zones they fight in means attrition is usually horrifically high, and it's common for the oldest surviving member of a squad to take on unit command as the Watchmaster, or be given a battlefield promotion to lieutenant, captain, and eventually colonel, sometimes incredibly quickly. Given the questionable age of corpsmen when they're initially deployed, the attrition rate of their regiments, and the tendency for fast battlefield promotion, this means that the command staff of a Krieg regiment might be very young compared to any other regiment. Kriegers have noted that they think of those who have stayed in service for years, even maybe a decade, as being old to the point of uselessness, and well past the point where they should have given their lives for the Emperor. Promotion is considered a duty to be dourly accepted, another unwelcome extension of their worthless lives rather than an honour, and Krieg officers tend to issue medals or any other trapping of glory, often only adopting the minimum requirements for battlefield identification. Similarly, the general Krieg ranking scheme stops at colonel. While there are Krieg generals in the Astra Militarum, this is only, again, because of deference to Departamento Munitorum conventions. In practice, Krieg officers are rarely comfortable holding any rank higher than colonel in respect of their ancient hero. All of this can make them difficult allies to fight alongside. Kriegers do not enjoy time off. They don't have recreation. They don't seem to have any camaraderie at all. Highly insular, emotionless, and taciturn, they barely laugh, barely talk in battle other than what is necessary, and they don't fraternize with other regiments. Allied soldiers are unlikely even to see their faces. Kriegers do not remove their gas masks any more than absolutely necessary, living, fighting, and dying in the same rubberized mask and goggles, their every inch covered in greatcoats and armor. Their masks are their uniform, and a corpsman is never off duty. At least, that's their excuse for never removing them. What personality the corpsmen do have tends to be self-deprecating, morbid, and fatalistic, and they've been known to make and carry relics of death into battle. This all tends to generate quite a lot of suspicion and resentment within the regiments fighting alongside them, especially if Krieg officers are given overall command of other regiments. Commissars attached to the Krieg formations frequently have to serve as liaisons, smoothing over misunderstandings with other regiments and perceived insults that the insular Krieg officers may not even know they've caused. Krieg commissars also experience a slightly different battlefield role. The mentality of the Krieg means that morale is rarely an issue. The Krieg regiments are morally disciplined, reliable, and self-sufficient, and they have the lowest desertion rates in the Astra Militarum. But the opposite is usually the problem. Krieg officers and units can be eager to the point of recklessness to spend their lives in the Emperor's service, and their attached commissars frequently have to rein in their desire to continually advance, even when withdrawal might be more expedient. Given their new status, Krieg raises a whole range of different regiments for the Imperial Guard, from tank formations to artillery batteries, but the most common force raised by the planet are their famed siege regiments. These are massively oversized infantry regiments consisting of thousands of corpsmen designed to operate as a battering ram, first by besieging and entrenching themselves around the enemy, and then by going over the top as a human wave, battering themselves against prepared positions until a breakthrough is eventually achieved. The fundamental doctrine of the siege regiments is to push forward at all costs once committed, heedless of casualties, until either their position is achieved or the attack called off by high command. To support this, the siege regiments are often deployed with massed artillery formations, providing cover for their attacks, or designed to soften up the enemy positions ahead of the big push. Kriegers make use of emplaced artillery far more than many other Imperial Guard regiments. Whole batteries of Earthshaker or Medusa trailers frequently deployed into the trenches. Their method of advance also sees them preferring specially modified and heavier forms of transport and armour. Krieg regiments tend to dislike the lightly armed Chimera transport and prefer far larger vehicles like the Gorgon, an assault boat that can deploy far more corpsmen and is durable enough to survive the grind across no man's land. Similarly, while the Kriegers do deploy Liman Russ squadrons, they tend to be of the fully environmentally sealed Mars pattern, and they field a great number of heavier tanks, from super heavies like the Baneblade to the lighter, more maintenance-friendly Macarius battle tanks. There are even homegrown marks of vehicle developed by the Kriegers during their civil war that still occasionally see service in the siege regiments, preferred for their simple construction, such as the light Siegfried scout tank and the massive slab-sided mobile fortress that is the Ragnarok heavy tank. In addition to those standard siege regiments, the Death Korps of Krieg have a few specialised formations that differ slightly from their regular Astra Militarum counterparts. Krieg regiments, like many regiments, use grenadier units, heavily armed veteran warriors, but rather than the infiltrators or special forces like drop troopers of say, the Cadian Kazakin or the Militarum Tempestus Scions, Krieg grenadiers are utilised as heavy line breakers. Promoted from the survivors of decimated squads, Krieg grenadiers consider themselves to have lived too long already martyred in the service of the Emperor, and to represent this, their gas masks are augmented with a death's head. They're given additional carapace plating over their regular uniforms and armed with heavy hellgun packs, and then used as the leading edge of an assault, deploying via fast-moving Centaur carriers to smash emplacements and assault key enemy points or to distract from the main attack. As could be expected, fatality rates amongst grenadiers are incredibly high, and their veteran status might only have been earned after a few months on the line, but it's still considered a high honour to be assigned to their ranks. The Krieg also make use of heavy cavalry in the form of their vaunted Death Rider squadrons. Although these are superficially similar to the Rough Riders used elsewhere in the Guard, the Death Riders are used very differently, partly because of their mounts, the Krieg steeds. Genetically modified from regular horses long ago during Krieg's Civil War, the Krieg steed is an engineered weapon capable of incredible levels of endurance and environmental tolerance. Bred with additional biosculpted organs, subdermal armor, and an implanted drug injection system, their steeds are larger, faster, and way more aggressive than regular horses, and their engineered hooves allow them to cross much more difficult terrain than many other Rough Rider formations. Their riders are chosen from those rare Kriegers that show some aptitude for independent thought and are armed with sabers, pistols, and the standard explosive hunting lances, and it's common for Krieg officers to be drawn from the ranks of their survivors. Death Rider squadrons are used for reconnaissance and scouting, like many other Rough Rider formations, but they're also used in mass cavalry charges as heavy linebreaker units. One other difference in the standard Death Korps platoon is their lack of battlefield medics. All regular corpsmen are trained in the very basics of first aid, the very basics, but beyond that, the job of dealing with casualties and the wounded is handled by the position of quartermaster. These troopers are drawn from the most fanatical and faithful of the corpsmen, and it's their job to administer the Emperor's mercy to any soldier who suffers wounds that leave them unable to advance with their squad, and also to reclaim their clothing, weapons, and equipment for use by future recruits. The lives of the Death Korps might be spent for minimal gains, but the wartime mindset of Krieg considers the reclamation of working equipment to be of way higher importance. And finally, the Kriegers are also rightly famed for the quality of their siege engineers. All corpsmen are trained in basic battlefield engineering, trench and dugout construction and the like, but those with an aptitude for this are assigned to the Engineers Corps, specialists in deep mining and underground construction. Krieg engineers build shafts, tunnels, and saps underneath enemy lines and underneath enemy fortifications, a horrifically dangerous job fighting in the claustrophobic confines of subterranean tunnels. They're armed and armoured for this. They often carry short-range shotguns and gas grenades and shells, and come equipped with specialist auspexes, melter charges, and digging equipment. Their support crews might carry mole launchers, tunneling their explosive charges through to enemy trenches, or for deep infiltration, the engineers are experts in the use of equipment like the Hades breaching drill, a boring machine used to cut through the last few yards of a tunnel, allowing an engineer force to storm enemy underground positions with the element of surprise on their side. With their particular preferences and skills, the Death Korps of Krieg are one of the most useful tools that the Imperium has relatively recently found at its disposal, an entire world of willing sacrifices, so deeply indoctrinated they can be deployed to any battlefront, any war zone, and be relied upon to fight the hardest without need for honour or recognition. To those they fight alongside, they might be faceless automatons, so indoctrinated they have no experience of what they're fighting for, barely relatable as fellow humans, but for the High Lords of Terror and the desperate requisitioners of the Departamento Munitorum, they're model soldiers, the ideal of what an Imperial Guard regiment should be. And it's interesting to compare them to the other regiments of the game, both in-world and off-screen. The Death Korps originally started life as an alternate colour scheme for the Armageddon Steel Legion range. They pop up in this early photo, and then again in the 3rd edition Imperial Guard Codex here. The Steel Legion were released at the end of the 90s as the last in a series of Guard regiments that were all themed around various 20th century armies, or rather themed around the gung-ho stereotypes of 20th century armies, the sort you might find in action movies or comic books. But at the start of the 2000s, there was a little bit of a split in how these old metal regiments should be continued. On one hand, with the advent of multi-part plastic sets, the Cadians and the Catachans both became the iconic poster regiments for the Imperial Guard in the main game. In fact, the Cadians were turned into something a bit like the Ultramarines, the most heroic, most professional, most emulated regiment in the entire Astra Militarum. But around the same time, Forge World was beginning its Imperial Armor series, which took a much darker, much more historically realistic look at 40k, and it was in the fourth Imperial Armor book, The Siege of Vrax, that the Death Korps returned, now as a full resin range, obviously inspired by the battlefields of World War I, and it's here that much of their lore was introduced. And it almost reads as a dark mirror to those poster regiments, one influenced less by the action-packed stories of wartime and more by the realities of it. And Forge World didn't just stop at making them look like real soldiers. Their uniform and tactics might be references to the First World War, but the thing that really makes the Krieg horrifically believable is their beliefs. The cult of sacrifice, a named rule for the Krieg in many versions of the game, is a reference to a real-world phenomenon, the propagandized way various countries tried to motivate their soldiers in the world wars by encouraging the veneration of martyrdom and the act of dying for the cause, and by promoting the idea that it would be shameful for a soldier to try and do anything else. Cults of sacrifice in wartime are suicide cults, and the Krieg are exactly that. A population radicalized by shame and kept that way by an imperium that finds it useful. So useful that it's willing to bend a lot of rules to keep them around. That shame isn't just for the official reason, the turning of their world against the Imperium, but also for the way in which it was handled by a commander who would rather murder an entire planet than see it rebel. As Steve Lyons writes in Krieg, perhaps deep down, they also felt it easier to proceed as if Colonel Jerton hadn't left them, just to follow the path he had set out for them. That way, the weight of his choices could rest upon his memory alone. None of them would be culpable. And that's what all that depersonalization's for. Kriegers have no names, no faces, and an extreme reluctance to be identified as an individual. Just keep your head down, never admit anything, and die as quickly as possible. It's the only way out, the only way to go with honor. As usual with 40k, it's an exaggerated version of a real-world thing, but it's not that exaggerated. Of course, as the years went on, some of this gritty realism was also added to those main poster factions too. Even in World, the idea of those heroic professional Cadians has been shown to be a bit of a myth. That planet, before its destruction, had its nobles placing their own children in safe or glorious roles, its profiteering and black markets running under the surface, just like you might expect of a real wartime economy. Nowadays, both the Cadians and the Krieg have their dark themes drawn from real-life wars. Ultimately though, I think it's the Death Korps that feel more true to 40k. The Kriegers epitomise one of the things 40k does best, why it works so well as a generally anti-war wargame. They're another faction, just like Space Marines, that on the surface, a newcomer might think are badass or cool, until they read even slightly further than the cover art, go slightly deeper than the silly memes, and realise just how horrific and desperate and depressingly realistic an idea the Death Korps of Krieg actually are. Thanks for watching. Well, that was jolly. If you'd like other videos just like this, there'll be one popping up on the right in a second. But in the meantime, if you'd like to support the channel, there are loads of ways you can do it. You can like and subscribe. You can look in the description below where there are some links to affiliate stores and special offers. And finally, check out the merch store. There are many more designs available on the website. See ya!